Okay, so in our last lesson, we talked about the fact that we take in 11 million bits of data. Our unconscious mind uses our instincts, preferences, and experiential programs to filter that data, and it gives our conscious mind a whopping 57 bits out of 11 million. Well, it gives 127 out of 11 million bits. Now, if you want to get a kind of a visual on that, imagine stacking toothpick boxes a mile high, and then imagine picking one toothpick box. That's the equivalent of picking 127 out of 11 million. Now, what that told me when I looked at that data and began to play with this is that, you know what, if I only pick 127 bits out of this 11 million, there have to be a lot of other bits in here that get thrown away, deleted, distorted, etc. that, well, what do you think? You think they might have a different reality than the one I selected based on my past and all my programming? You better believe it, that's the case. And that's what we're going to get into more and more in this class, all right? But for now, I want to talk a little bit more about these individual mindware programs and how they impact into our lives. And then in the next lesson, we're going to take it and put it all together, all right? So, instincts, we all know, let's take fight or flight, all right? So let's say somebody is pointing a gun at me, all right? So let's say that comes in here and it hits the fight or flight. Well, what's going to happen is as soon as that sensory input hits into that fight or flight instinct, that instinct is going to trigger and immediately cause a response, all right? There is going to be a reaction. It is not going to wait for it to come down here, get into your conscious mind, and for you to react. That's not what instincts do. So we're either going to flee, we're going to fight, or more likely, we're going to freeze. You know, that's the word that gets left out of the fight and flight instinct, and yet it's actually the most prevalent response. But the instinct will take priority. Now, part of that is because one of the focuses of your unconscious mind is to keep you safe. All right, so that fight or flight instinct and any instinct that relates to a threat, anything that relates to a threat, takes precedent in your own programming, and your unconscious mind will respond to that before anything else. Now, the other thing it's designed to do, your unconscious mind, is to focus on what you want, and whatever it thinks you want is to deliver it to you, which is why our focus is so important, and we'll learn more about that in some of the later lessons. So, we have instincts. Now, preferences, we talked a little bit about toward or away, but let's talk about another preference that I think is really important. So there's another preference that's around communication, all right? Actually, you know what, let's do that in the right color. Hopefully I don't knock my board down. All right, so communication has something called buffers, all right? And each of us has a certain buffer for how much information we take in and process before we take a pause to move that information, process it, and go back and gather more. We grab and then and move back and forth. So some of us have paragraph buffers. By now, you probably figured out I'm a paragraph buffer because I speak in paragraphs, and the way we externally present is the way we internally process. All right? So I'm a paragraph speaker. Somebody else might be a processor that processes one sentence. So here's what happens in that case. Let's go over here for a minute. So let's say each of these is a word, and I'm a paragraph person, and I'm now speaking in paragraphs. And let's say somebody else is a sentence person, all right? So what happens is they listen to the sentence, they hear, take in the sentence, but then at the end of the sentence, they take a pause, and then they start again here, and then they take a pause, right? Well, guess what? They miss part of what you say, and it gets all jumbled. And that would be one of the many reasons for miscommunication. How's that for a little preference program? And you'll learn more and more about these throughout the courses, all right? So then we have our experiential programs. And as I've said before, our experiential programs drive the majority of our behavior, all right? And here's what happens. So I'm going to use my personal example. I recovered memories at the age of 49 of being tortured and abused by some members of my family for a lot of years. All right, I mean tortured. So if I wasn't perfect, and the definition of perfect changed all the time, but if I wasn't perfect, I went to the cellar, and the cellar was set up to hurt me. So, and you don't need to know any more about that. But what happened is, I got this program, and I'm going to use blue here because I think it shows up better. I got this program that said perfect equals survival. All right? So that was in my childhood. And by the way, with these experiential programs, anything that happens to you or you hear before age 7 becomes a program in your mindware, because you don't have a critical faculty to tell you what's true or false, right or wrong. So if it's said to you, if it happens to you, it becomes a program, and those become the fundamental programs that drive the development of who we are, personality, if you will. So I was one of the programs I had was I had to be perfect, or I felt like all hell was gonna break loose, right? Because it was a survival level instinct that was triggered. And yeah, that gets involved. So I have this perfection program. So what happens is all my data comes through, and if I'm not perfect, it triggers, yeah, okay, survival, and it creates another perfection program and comes down in here. And off to the side, it creates anxiety, because guess what? I wasn't perfect, and that's a threat. So my unconscious mind would trigger some anxiety, and it would filter that program, and I'd create another program about, oh my God, I have to be perfect. Now, by the way, this program drove me to drive myself and everyone nuts. Everything had to be perfect. My house had to be perfect before I went to sleep at night. Everything about me had to be perfect. I timed myself putting makeup on to make sure that the motions were the best possible thing, all right? That I was optimized motion, right? I mean, nuts things. I also drove everybody else nuts because every single bit of my work had to be perfect. Now, it's probably why I became a successful consultant, because I delivered more than anybody else and it was always perfect. But it drove the whole world nuts. And by the way, I'm much better now that I no longer have that program, because I did release it with some of the techniques we'll talk about later. But what happened was, so I have this drive coming through here that are all these perfect mindware programs. Have to be perfect, have to be perfect. Well, first of all, this is what's known as a Gestalt in Gestalt therapy, just as a little aside. But secondly, this childhood program has now become a driving program in my adult life. And by the way, do you think that program, with all of its sub-programs within this Gestalt, do you think that has an impact on what comes into my reality? You better believe it. It changed my life, because I could never be safe or comfortable because of that program. And by the way, we all have these kinds of programs. I have a traumatic one, but to a child, anything is trauma. It doesn't have to be big T, it can be little t. So all of us have some of these limiting programs in here. And that's what gets in the way of our confidence. That's why we have the scary voices, etc. And part of what we're going to talk about in this course is how you can get rid of them forever.